I'm going to stay right here because I don't think I can get through all of it. I will never forget the joke of the minister who was so new and he was so nervous and he couldn't do anything but read a sermon, and so he thought, I'd go back to my homiletics professor and maybe there's a tip that he could give to me. And so he did, and the homiletics professor said, oh yes, try this, this might work for you. As long as you prepare well and you memorize your sermon, it'll all be good. And so yes, this nervous young preacher said, okay, all right, very good. He went back, he prepared and he memorized and he was doing well. And the tip was that if he forgot where he was going next, is to repeat the last line. Very simple. So he got to the place where he was quoting scriptures. In the old days it was King James, and he said, I'm coming to thee. It was a word from the Lord. And he couldn't remember where he was going to go next. So he said, oh yes, I remember. I am coming to thee. He still couldn't remember, and he didn't have any notes in front of him. So he leaned heavily on the pulpit and said, I am coming. And at that moment in time, the pulpit collapsed and he ended up on the lap of a little old lady in the front. And he said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. She said, well, you warned me 3 times. I don't want to be one of those. So, here's a question. Thinking about consciousness. This is a very amazing term, and scientists and doctors and others are trying to figure out what consciousness is. Because they've discovered that when somebody gets a heart transplant or some other organ, that somehow their personality changes a bit. It takes on some of the qualities of the person who donated the organ. Very strange. I thought, well, consciousness has got to be about the brain, and no, it turns out it isn't quite that limited. So, let me ask you some questions. Any of you ever had the sense of déjà vu, that as though you've experienced something and you're getting it again? Yeah. How about premonition? This is the one I like the best. You suddenly somebody comes to your mind. Think about Sally or whatever, and suddenly the phone rings, and it's Sally.
Yep.
It's weird, isn't it? How about the sixth sense, as it's sometimes called? When you have a feeling that someone, or some animal even, is looking at you, and you turn around and they are. Yes. Or you have an intuition about something, but you don't have any evidence, you just have a sense that something is true, and sure enough, later on, it turns out to be true. Well, what do scientists do with those kind of things? Well, if they're a Western-trained scientist, materialistic, into the physics of things, they don't have any way of understanding that at all. So I want to tell you a story that happened when I was a minister in a church in Ontario. It was a family that I was quite fond of, but we didn't see them very often. They had several kids, and they were young kids, and both mom and dad worked, and so they were busy, and we didn't see them in church very often. But one day, they were coming back from Toronto on a very busy 4-lane highway. It was divided, and something happened on the other lane. A vehicle ended up going in front of them. They collided. And to make a long story short, they all did quite well. One son had a broken leg or something like that, but the rest of them did fine, as opposed to the vehicle in front of them where there was death. The strange thing is that when the dust kind of settled, when they all got reoriented after the collision, and he, in those days, had a cell phone that was pretty good, he pulled out to call the police and ambulance, and then they realized that there was a Bible sitting on the dash of their vehicle. Strange, because that Bible was buried under a whole bunch of other books in what was a milk cart in the very back of the van behind 3 rows of seats. There were no other books on the dash of the vehicle or anywhere close to it. She became the Sunday school superintendent soon after that. Yeah, how do we make sense of these kinds of things? Incidences. there's no real way of making sense if we're going to be strictly the scientific worldview. So here we are in Brecon, and we understand that there's more to reality than just meets the five senses. So then the question comes, what is faith? Is faith just believing some things? Yes, there is God. Is that belief? Or is belief knowing that God is really intricately involved in my life and in our lives in a very deep and meaningful way? What is faith? Does belonging to Jesus, being a follower of Jesus, mean going to a given church such as ours, or being caught up in something that's far bigger than we are? And if we are people of faith, I think you understand there's more involved than just intellectual believing. So as I said, Western science is into the physical world. It's very materialistic and very mechanistic. It does not believe in such things as ghosts, premonitions, intuition, or the divine. However, there's another form of science that's beginning to emerge. It's called quantum physics. Any of you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yes, that's more of an energy-based way of doing science. And they are doing some very interesting experiments, such as, for example, they've tried doing, well, they've successfully done this. They've had some people pray for a person who's in the hospital, who's gone through surgery, just give them the first name, no other details, just pray for them. And then there's a person who's gone through exactly the same surgery who's not having any prayers for him or her. And they've tried that multiple times, and you won't be too surprised to know that the ones who've been prayed for, on average, do better than the ones who haven't been prayed for. My sister Brenda nearly died 2 months ago, and they didn't think she was going to live. And then when she did live, they didn't think her kidneys would ever come back to life. And today I think she's going to get the good news that not only is she alive, but her kidneys are working. And that has been, I think, somehow impacted by the many, many people who prayed for her. I love the fact that we pray for people here in Brecon, and we're going to have an opportunity to do that quietly. But together, our prayers here as a community are worth more than just a few words. So, is it true that our consciousness just resides in our brains? I don't think that you and I would believe that. Perhaps this is one reason why we experience strange things, especially when we get our rational minds out of the way. Maybe it is true that God is alive us. God is among us. Praise be to God.
Every day we will bless you and praise your name forever.
O God, you are great and highly to be praised. Your greatness is beyond all measure.
One generation shall praise your works to another and declare your marvelous deeds.
I will speak of your splendor and glory and all your wonderful works.
Righteous in all your ways and loving in all your deeds.
You are near to all who call to you, to all who call on you in truth.
You fulfill the desire of those who revere you, to hear their cry, and you save them.
You watch over all who love you, but the wicked you will destroy.
My mouth will speak your praise, O God.
Let every creature bless your holy name forever. We
gospel reading this morning is from Luke 20, verses 27 to 38, the question about the resurrection. Some Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up the children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second, and the third married her. And so in the same way all 7 died childless. Finally the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God, not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. In hearing God's inspiration to us,
may the Spirit bless us with wisdom and wonder as we ponder the meaning of these words for our lives.
Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our lover and our Savior. Amen. Death. Who wants to talk about death? I can tell you it's not a popular subject in our culture in our day. We tend to sanitize the word. We use the word expression, she passed away, because we just don't like it at all. I think most people would rather talk about sex than death. I suspect that this is the only time of the year when the subject is really broachable. Remembrance Day, when we remember the many, many, many people who died in First or Second World Wars or other wars. And the many other people that didn't die, but it really messed up their lives. So, okay, we can do it now, but it's not pleasant. I can tell you that it's not pleasant for those who've been through that experience of saying goodbye to a loved one, as I had to do 2 weeks ago, when my father, after 9 months of struggling with cancer, finally passed away. He finally died. But he didn't really die, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. He left us. He left this earthly plane. He was finally at rest. Nevertheless, I must say that death sucks. It does. We don't want to say goodbye to loved ones, do we? It's not easy. And sure, I'm glad that my dad is back with, well, Joy was her name, and I think he's in joy in so many ways. And I'm glad that we were able to say our goodbyes to him before he did die. And I think he's really glad for that too. And it's not easy. So when my mom died 3.5 years ago, she literally dropped dead. She had a stroke and she was gone in a twinkle of an eye. It's hard for all of us, of course, because we loved her and we were fond of her. Thankfully, I had an experience of her 10 days later, I was in the balcony of the old Brecon church. I was doing PowerPoint or something. We were singing a hymn about spirit. It was a new hymn to me. I was quite unfamiliar with it. It was a beautiful hymn. And suddenly, about up in this quadrant of my vision, remember I was up on the balcony, so most people were down below. Up here was suddenly a vision of my mother, smiling at me. It was as real as anything I've ever experienced. And it lasted for only 5 or maybe 10 seconds. But the memory of her smile, her speaking, her eyes spoke into mine, saying, "All is well. You are loved unconditionally. It's all good." That experience, even though it lasted but a moment, has been now permanently seared into my memory. And after that, I was able to do my grieving much more easily. I think that we in Christian churches are more familiar with death and certainly more at home, perhaps, if you can say that. Certainly we're more acquainted with it and we're more likely to talk about death. Well, because Jesus died. And it was a shock to his disciples and others who loved him and followed him, including, I'm sure, his mother and his brothers. So we're used to that theme. Certainly as we come up to Lent and go into Easter, we will repeat that theme. And I think we at Brecon are very familiar with death because we've been to lots of funerals. It's true. Maybe our culture has so much trouble talking about death because, we have an amazing healthcare system. We have clean drinking water. When that was instituted in cities, life expectancy basically doubled. We have amazing technologies that keep our cars going as long as we want them to go, as long as we're willing to keep on paying. And so if we can keep our car going forever, then maybe we can just deny death itself and carry on. My master's degree was on the perception of death amongst extended care nurses and aides. And the famous quote that we got from the research was, this fellow when asked, "Well, what do you think about your own death and dying?" He said, "Who, me? I'm not going to die." He did laugh. But who wants to consider that? It's not easy. So I think that our culture has difficulty with it. Apparently 150 years ago, says my very smart brother Brian, he says that in those days, in the Victorian era, death was talked about very freely and openly. And maybe that's because people died at such an early age in those days. Well, people also talked about death in Jesus' time too, but maybe for the same reason. And here, in our last reading of the series we've been doing on Luke, this will be our last one, I think, here the Sadducees try trapping Jesus to see whether they might be able to get him and take him out, because they were feeling criticized by him and they didn't like that at all. So here's what they did in the trap. They talked about, in Jewish law, if a woman's husband died, then if he had any brothers, then he would have to marry her and have children through that union, so that the family might be able to continue on. Well, in the parable, or in the story rather, 7 brothers all marry her and none of them give her any children, and she then dies. So then the question, the trap is, so which one of them is married to her in heaven? It's a pretty good trap. But Jesus saw through that, of course. And so he said, but in heaven there is no death. There's only life. And there's no marriage in heaven. There's only continuation of praise and glory. And those people are not married, per se. They all belong together, in essence. So the question is mute. And of course, they realized that they hadn't won their argument. So from God's perspective, there is no death. Tell that to somebody who's grieving a loved one. Not an easy one. And I don't suggest you say that either at that moment in time. Well, I think we know, that when someone dies, like when my dad did, he had one last big breath, And I imagine at that moment in time, his soul left his body. And I can tell you that afterwards, his body looked like it belonged to a wax museum. He just seemed so strange. It just wasn't my father any longer. So this is the crux of the matter, I think, is the soul leaves the body. The consciousness, if you like, the one that goes beyond just our brains, leaves. Just because the doctor says or pronounces somebody dead doesn't mean that they necessarily are. So that's pretty hard for some people to believe that there's something after this life. So I went to a seminar. I want to tell you just a little titch about what is called near-death experiences. Anyone heard of those?
Yeah.
Yes. They're really strange. They're totally out of the box. They really don't make any sense unless you are aware that consciousness goes beyond our body life. So in the last 50 years or so, medical science and knowledge and technology has improved to such a degree that people may be in near death or seemingly dead, and they're doing surgery, they're trying to save their life, and then they come through the surgery and they regain consciousness in the sense that we usually use that, and then they tell these strange stories. Well, 50 years ago, people had those experiences were just shunned because that was just too weird. But in more recent years, when more and more of these people who've been through these experiences are saying things that are virtually the same kind of themes. I saw the light, and somebody I knew was there to greet me. And, well, there was a silver cord, some people say, going back to my life, and it never got detached, and I had a choice, or maybe I didn't have a choice to go back, and so I did. Other people say that they are kind of hovering over the surgery, and they can see and hear everything that's going on, even though the body that they're watching is unconscious. And sometimes their consciousness, their soul, whatever you want to call it, drift to other rooms, adjacent rooms, where they have no possibility of knowing what was going on in those rooms. But they accurately describe what they heard and they saw. Sometimes people are able to know history, family history, that they weren't told earlier in life. Sometimes people have other kinds of experiences. Now, not everyone has a pleasant experience. There are those who go through a very difficult time, and it's like they're in limbo until they finally arrive to a place they need to go to. One person I heard about was totally atheistic, didn't show love, was very focused on money, was just, maybe kind of an Ebenezer. And he was there in this limbo land, this